Good afternoon, everyone. We are so glad you joined us this afternoon. First, before we get started, if you have a cell phone, flip, smart, or otherwise, now is the time to turn it off. Okay? Turn it off. Turn it down. Don't let it buzz. Because
I'm about to speak, but my sister just told me, and she's in critical shape in the hospital.
okay.
With COVID, and I've got to go make a call back and see what happens back.
Okay. You'll have time. My name is Helen Brown. I am with United Farmers USA out of Manning, South Carolina. Today I am going to be introducing to you speakers who will come and speak to you about what they do. And they are part of, this is the Partnerships and Coalition. Our first speaker for this afternoon, Kate Rensink, is currently a board member of the Kansas Grazing Land Coalition, and along with his wife, Amanda, they are raising sixth-generation Kansas ranchers in their sons, okay? He has also been on a various amount of boards as chairmen, presidents, and today, along with his brother, they manage Blue Partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause for our first speaker this afternoon, Kate Rensink.
Turned on, how's that? Good? Okay. Miss Helen, I'm going to need you to keep me on time too, because we got a lot of slides, probably more than we're going to have time for. My partner in crime, Russell Blue, actually isn't my brother. He's another board member for KGLC, wasn't able to be with us today, had things going on back home. So I'm going to fly solo on this and hopefully do it justice. The name of this presentation, the Kansas Great Plains Grasslands Initiative, will make more sense towards the end of the presentation. But this is a project that we've been involved with now for about a year, and I'm extremely excited and proud to be a part of it. It's a true grassroots effort that started at the ranch level. And it'll be more evident of just what we've got accomplished at the state level when we get into this. I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize the other team players in this initiative. There are a couple more ranchers on here, and I'll tell their importance here after a bit. But then we've got some agency personnel too that have been very key and instrumental in getting this thing off the ground. So 1990, I was 9 years old. But I was old enough to remember riding around with my dad out in the pastures, and at that time, really all we were chasing besides cattle was musk thistle. We didn't have a whole lot of other issues out there. You might find an occasional tree pop up somewhere, but it wasn't something that we were very mindful of. But as time went on, we started seeing a lot more issues show up in terms of woody species. Along with that, we were having neighbors having conversations about where in the heck are all these trees coming from. We didn't have these in the 50s and 60s when we were growing up. We didn't even have them 10 years ago, and now we do. Where in the world are they coming from? Well, fast forward to 2020, this red indicates woody encroachment within Kansas, and it's pretty evident where they're coming from, right? They're coming from the east. And I'm not throwing the eastern part of the U.S. under the bus. It's just the natural evolution of what's happened. But this is something that we've always kind of had a feeling was going on. We just didn't have a way to measure it or look at it from a spatial view. And through some new technologies that we'll talk about here in a second, we've now got the tools and resources to be able to not only find out what's going on, but we can track it, we can measure it, and we can put some plans of action in place to hopefully combat it and push back a little bit. So one of the issues that we run into in Kansas, and I'm sure many of you in the range and pasture world nationwide run into, is that we don't speak the same language as the other people in the ag industry, right? All the crop farmers, they tend to talk about yields and tons of stuff. Well, us in the range world, we don't really have that way to talk, and we didn't really have a way to say, well, you might have produced X bushels of corn, but we produce X tons or whatever of forage. We could maybe on the local level or on our home ranch, but we really couldn't say much at the geographic level or the regional level. Well, now we can, and this came out of Nebraska. Dirac Twidwell, who's a range ecologist up there, I showed his name. is on our science team. But in 2019, Kansas rangelands alone, and that's true range, that's not the tame pastures in the eastern part of the state, we produced a shade over, well, about 32.6 million tons of forage. And so now we can start talking the same language as some of our counterparts in the grain world, and that also helps us communicate a little better to those that may not be in the ranch world and say, hey, not only do we have a big production role, but we've also got a big economic role. And if any of you are familiar with Kansas, the Flint Hills is what everybody thinks of, right? Well, we've got the other western 3/4 of the state that is made up largely of rangelands. And so all that combined, we normally are about that 30 to 35 million, depending on our rainfall. So what does that even matter with this presentation? Well, we're talking about woody encroachment, and again, we never had a really good way to track and talk about how much grasslands we were losing to rangeland. We had a little bit of an idea about acreage, but we never had true biomass loss until now. So the question has been posed, how many pounds of forage have we actually lost to that woody encroachment? And through that technology, we now have a really good idea that we are, just in that 2019 alone, we lost a little over 2 million tons of forage, grazable forage or harvestable forage, to the woody encroachment. When I say woody encroachment, that's trees, brush, you name it, anything that's kind of hard and looks like a tree or a shrub, that's what I'm talking about. If we look at that from that 1990 to 2020 range, we're at 28 million tons of forage lost. And if you put that back in, again, some of the cash grains or the commodity crops that actually have a market, that's roughly about the same amount of alfalfa that Kansas produces in 1 year. And that's just totally out the window when we put it relative to rangeland. Well, what does that mean? That's a pretty big number. That's kind of like our federal debt, right? It's kind of hard to get your head wrapped around when you start talking those big numbers. Well, let's put that in simple terms that I can understand. If we use 1,500-pound round bales, that's almost 3 million round bales that we've lost in that amount of time in just 1 year. And to help give that further context, that'll wrap around Kansas a little over 2 times. That's how much hay we're losing. Another way to look at that is I Googled it real quick this morning. That's enough to line up that hay from here to Los Angeles. Okay? So that's the kind of threat that we're up against in Kansas, at least, and I'm sure other states are dealing with the same thing. So, folks, I want to introduce you to public enemy number 1 back in my neck of the woods. And you might ask yourself, well, that's an innocent little juniper, potted. It can't do much harm. We're going to hang tinsel from it here and celebrate in a couple weeks. What's the big deal? Well, that innocent little juniper has a lot of buddies, and when they get together and congregate, this is what it turns into in our pasture and rangelands in Kansas. This is not to say that we don't have other woody species. We do. We have Osage orange, we've got honey locust, we've got Siberian and American elm, Japanese elm, and they'll all drive you to drinking. I mean, they'll all show up, but this is our biggest problem statewide because in all 105 counties, we've got cedar trees in all 105 counties. And if you look at the 3 ecoregions that have the most significance in our state, that's the Flint Hills, the Gyp Hills, which are down in south central Kansas, and then the Smoky Hills, where I'm at, in the north central part of the state. Back in '88, we had about 2 million acres that, total non-crop acres in those 3 ecoregions, a little over 8 million acres. And since that 1988, 1990 time frame that I showed you, we now have at least 1.5 million acres in those 3 ecoregions that have at least a 5% canopy cover. And 5% doesn't sound like much, but when we get into the science side, you'll see that 5% is a very important threshold that we have to pay attention to. So what is the vision of this initiative that I'm talking about? Well, as it would be for most of our western states, we want these big, large, intact grassland cores, right? We want them to be picturesque. We want them to be free of any type of trees, mainly because not only for the aesthetic value, but they're a heck of a lot easier to manage, both from a livestock standpoint as well as just a management standpoint. They're a heck of a lot easier to take care of. We want to get away from these small, isolated cores because those are difficult to manage from a range and pasture management standpoint. But then, you know, I know some of you have to do this, but who wants to chase a cow through that? if you're horseback, how many cedar tree branches you want smacking you in the face? That's what we want to get away from. And unfortunately, over time, as that westward march of the woody encroachment has happened, we're starting to see more and more of these isolated remnants that are just very difficult to manage. So at the bottom of this slide, you'll see kind of the theme of the presentation: rancher-driven, science-informed, and agency-supported. So let me start with the first one, rancher-driven. This is something that we recognized, again, a long time ago. As producers and land managers across the state, we saw this as a challenge, and so we started reaching out for answers. And again, we reached out to Dirac up at UNL because he had some really neat technologies that he was working with other folks on, the Rangeland Analysis Platform that some of you are familiar with. We asked those folks to come in, the people that were smarter than us, and we talked about why is this a problem, what the heck's taking place, and what can we do. So this is just one example of one of the producer meetings that we had down in the south central part of the state. We did site visits to kind of look at, all right, what is it on our landscape? What's it starting to look like? And all the while that these meetings were taking place, NRCS started perking their ears up. They started listening. They started to attend. We reached out to them and said, hey, how can you help us? What can we do? Along the way then, some of the, I guess, more vocal, if you want to call it that, ranchers were then kind of voluntold maybe that you were going to be on an advisory board. And so there are several of us that have now kind of served on this rancher advisory board to help steer the ship, if you will, about what this initiative is going to look like. But the moral of the story here is this started at the ground level. This wasn't something that NRCS necessarily started and it came from the top down. This really came from the bottom up. And that's what's really cool about this whole project. This is actually our rancher advisory group. And this lady right here is Karen Woodrich. She's our state conservationist in Salina at the state office. We took her out to the middle of the Flint Hills on the back of that feed truck, and we just showed Karen this is what we want it to look like, because as you think of the Flint Hills, the iconic Flint Hills, we do have some of those large intact cores around that obviously is very fire dependent. But the ranchers are really the ones that their voices are being heard, and they're the ones really putting the effort forward to work with the agencies, and I'll show who all that is here in a minute, to really get some change made. So where does the science come in? I'm by no means an expert on the science of this thing, but we're leaning on a bunch of different research projects that have been done, some new technologies in the platform that some of you, again, I said you might be familiar with. Dirac's really been our bread and butter on that deal. We hang our hats on him a lot. And there's been some really neat literature come out that is kind of going to help, I think, people look at rangelands in a new way and manage rangelands in a new way, or at least in a different way than what we're used to. So this kind of pivots on 4 different stages as we talk about the science. There's obviously the transition states that we're all familiar with, but now we're starting to look at things like exposure, dispersal and recruitment, and then that pure form of intact grasslands. And that's all outlined in this publication. That's a joint effort between Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma State, I think Texas is involved, as well as our federal agencies. They've helped draft this, and I'd encourage you to check that out. That's actually printed by Oklahoma Extension. Awesome publication. It's pretty robust and a little dry in places, but it's a really good manual to follow. So what is our vision versus what's our reality today? As I mentioned earlier, we've got this huge westward march of woody encroachment, and unfortunately it's winning at this point. It just keeps moving west, and through the platform we can kind of monitor some up and coming areas, but we can also fairly well hone down as far as what's pretty much been lost at this point. And this really kind of helped drive it home to me. I'm a very visual learner, and when I can see something of that magnitude, that helps me understand something better. And so I hope you can understand what's going on here, and if something like that doesn't motivate you, I'm really not sure what will. It's very telling, and if you look at it on a regional or even a national scale, it just gets scarier. That's just Kansas. So what did we miss? Well, you can see that arrow pointing to that one tree out there. For years, we thought that, trees did have a place on the landscape, and in some ecoregions they do. We've got cross timbers and things like that in parts of Kansas where there might be some savannas or something where trees are totally appropriate. But out in these big rangelands, used to be that we would see that tree and drive on by. It kind of became part of the family. We knew it was out there, but we didn't really think about it. And if we really looked at that tree, that's an Osage orange. They've got these nice little balls that some people like to spray lacquer on and decorate with, but they are a big, big problem, to the tune of, just on that branch alone, there was 30 hedge balls, and each one of them have about 250 seeds per ball, and so that's 7,500 seeds per year just on that one branch. And we know that the recruitment area around these trees is about 200 yards, which if you extrapolate, that's about 26 acres that that one tree is impacting. And we used to never even really give it much attention. So let's turn to that juniper again. Again, some of these we would leave behind and not think anything of it. Well, there's the juniper berries, and some of you from the western states totally get this. That one tree right there does about 1.5 million seeds annually. And so you can see there's already some recruitment going on out here with some of these little seedlings. Again, one tree, 26 acres. It doesn't take many trees to cover quite a few acres. We also didn't really understand this idea of vulnerability, and so with this new way of thinking, we start to look at things like vulnerability or sensitivity. We start to look at exposure, and that kind of helps us get an idea of what our risk might be for a parcel of land. It might be a larger area. Then we also have to manage or factor in what our adaptive capacity is. What are we willing to do to help combat some of these things? Is it prescribed fire? Is it a pair of loppers and a four-wheeler? Is it funding? And that all stems down in that cone to what our vulnerability is on our rangelands. So where does the agency come in? Well, so NRCS had kind of already beat us to the punch in the fact that they had this framework called the Working Lands for Wildlife, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with if you've been around that world. They've been working kind of in this similar situation for years, and there was already a consortium of Midwestern or Great Plains states, that's where the name comes from, that they were already starting to talk about this. But what I'm proud to say is that Kansas, through our rancher-driven efforts and the ability for our state office to embrace those concerns, is Kansas was the first one out of the gate of the Great Plains states to launch this. Again, that was a year ago. Now we know that some of our neighbor states, Oklahoma, Texas, they're starting to get their initiative ramped up, and it will all follow this similar framework and look very similar. It's going to be rancher-driven, and they're going to use many of the same funding sources, which is EQIP, to get some of these things done. So as we started to look at what are our priority areas, we used that platform map on the top. We started to mix in some of our wildlife habitat mapping, and again, you can kind of see some very similar trends as far as where our grasslands are and where our prime habitat is. And then we started plugging in, all right, kind of what is our shape files that we want to work with to target some of these funding mechanisms too. And that's why we came up with the Smoky Hills up here in the north central part, the Red Hill or Gyp Hills, whichever you want to call it here, and then those Flint Hills that you're all probably familiar with. That's where we were targeting our efforts, because that is what we consider to still be our last remaining iconic kind of grasslands within Kansas. Now again, there's still a lot of rangelands to the west, but that's where we really wanted to focus the efforts of year one. So again, the agency helps us translate all that science that Dirac and all his cohorts come up with, and they try to water that down and help with what they're good at, putting that technical service on the ground and help ranchers understand that. They help in identifying where that woody encroachment is happening, what our risk and vulnerability is that I talked about earlier, and then they help, along with some of our other supporting partners, in drafting some plans at the local level to combat this. And I will kind of blow through this because it's kind of same stuff. So, what are some of our results? Well, what we were able to get done, and I'll mention Karen again because Karen's been very instrumental in this. We get around $26 million-ish for our general EQIP funds in Kansas. Of that, Karen felt strong enough about this effort or this initiative that she originally had earmarked $3 million of that $26 million for kind of this pilot project, which again, for just a bunch of redneck cowboys in Kansas, we thought that was a pretty big win. Well, that doesn't tell the whole story. We ended up using all that, so she gave us another $1 million to put on the ground. What that money was used for was obviously to go out and inventory these ranches that were signing up to try to figure out ways to push back and defend those cores and push back on the encroached areas. And so we got a little over 93,000 acres inventoried in a one-year time. And granted, for the western states, that probably doesn't sound like much. That might be 1 or 2 ranches in some states. But in Kansas, we are still fairly small in scale when it comes to individual ranch size. Our cow herd is a little less than 100 head. Most 100% livestock or cattle operations are probably in that 1,000 to 2,000 acre ballpark-ish. So you can tell we're reaching a lot of different operations just on the inventory side. So we were able to ultimately get about 89,000 acres, just shy of 90,000 acres under contract for this first year. We're set for 3 years. Again, we expended about $4,000, or I shouldn't say we expended it because not all the practices are done, but we've got that at least allocated and those contracts approved. I believe we're up to about $6 million for year 2. So we got the original 4 plus 2 more for this next year, just because people are starting to beat down the doors. They're seeing this type of information, and we have busted our tails working the state, trying to get this type of information out and make people aware that we're trying to do something new with this. The nice part of this initiative, and I guess I should have, let me back up here real quick. So for years, most of our incentive programs or cost share programs have focused on property that's already basically went straight state transition. We've got these big overgrown areas, and in fact, for most of our programs, you couldn't even qualify for cost share funding until you reached a certain level of canopy cover. And what it felt like is that we were just, using a squirt bottle to put out a fire, or we were sending an ambulance to a mass casualty deal that just, we couldn't fix it. The problem with what we were doing is we were spending millions and millions of farm bill dollars on projects that once they got cleared out, they were more likely to come back in a few years, and they were going to come back at a faster rate than what they did at the first time. And so through this new mode of thinking, we're like, why are we doing that? Let's focus back over on the intact portion and incentivize good management and not incentivize that poor management like we had done for years. And I think we're starting to change some people's minds on ways to think about this, not only at the local level, but again at the federal agency level. And it's really reassuring to know that they're listening and that they're wanting to make the change, and that they are working hand in hand with the ranchers in Kansas. And now it'll be going out to some of our neighboring states in an effort to make this not just a Kansas Great Plains Grassland Initiative, but the whole Great Plains. So I mentioned our partners. Each one of these partners that's listed here, we invited stakeholders from this group as well as others to start listening to some of the things that we were concerned about at the ranch level. We were concerned, we invited them to listen to what NRCS was thinking at their level, and it literally did not take anything to get these folks to buy into it and say, how can we help? We've gotten all sorts of partnership, cooperation from each of these, all the way from skid steers being operated to funding, to other technical resources, to communications. We've just got a bunch of people that have jumped on board and said, yes, this is a true issue. The grasslands of Kansas are important, and we want to fix it. And so this is just a small list of a number of a number of partners that continue to come on board each and every day as we make progress and continue to push back on these woody encroachments that we're seeing in Kansas and throughout the Great Plains. So I guess just to kind of wrap up so we have some time for questions here at the end, I like to think of ourselves as guardians of the grasslands. This was actually coined by Dirac. He kind of thought this was kind of a cool way to describe ourselves, and I think that's really kind of what we're all trying to do here in South Carolina this week, is become guardians of the grasslands in our own neck of the woods, and each of us are going to be doing it a little bit differently. This is just one kind of novel way that we're doing it in Kansas. And I will say that this isn't something that's new. One of the things that this initiative is trying to encourage is a community framework within ranching, right? We've always met at the coffee shop and we've talked over pickup hoods, but at least in Kansas anyway, and I know it's different in other states, we really haven't worked that well together or across fence lines. What this is trying to do is to get us think broader and think outside of that 5-wire barbed wire fence that we've got up, because really the only way we're going to get these large intact cores is if we all work together. And so there's a lot of sociology that's going into this about how to get people to communicate, how to get people to work together, how to form alliances. And so I was in the podcast session here prior to this one, and he talked a lot about that sociological aspect of how people behave and what it takes to get people to act and make changes. And I am not a sociologist by any stretch of the imagination, but I think what's neat about this is we're going beyond the hard science of range management, and like what he talked about in that other session, we're going into behavior change and how we can do a better job of communicating with one another. So this has been a really gratifying project, and again, we're just in year one. I think as we get into year 2 and 3, we're going to see even more positive results and more acres covered to where this kind of becomes a kind of a normal type of operation for us. And hopefully what we're all hoping for, I guess, is that as you look at the NRCS or EPA or whatever it is that this filters its way up and that they start doing development of policy in a little bit different way than what has historically been done. That's kind of the fingers crossed ultimate goal out of this deal. But it's been a really cool project, and I appreciate the time here this afternoon to come and share a little bit of that with you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions because there was a lot of stuff we couldn't cover in 20 minutes. Yeah, Tony.
I'm sorry I missed the first 5 minutes, but you may have said a couple of things. What type of cedar is that?
That's Eastern Red Cedar.
Eastern red?
Yep.
And the density from east to west, is that a soils deal or is that just the migration that's happening?
So probably a little of both. Our richer soils are on the eastern side of the state historically. We've got a lot of our glacial soils up in the northeast. We've got a really shallow clay pan, through the Flint Hills and on into eastern Kansas. We've also got a lot smaller tracts of land as you go east. And so with that comes absentee landowners, more recreational type landowners. So it facilitates that westward march. But I think all in all, it's just that seed dispersal. And what's interesting is like the Flint Hills where fire is the norm, and they burn 2.5 to 3 million acres every year, they're still losing the battle.
They're still losing?
Still losing the battle.
Okay. What's the major type of eradication that you're using?
So prescribed fire in the eastern part of the state's the big one. The unfortunate part is you get further west in the state, fire isn't so much in the culture, so they rely a lot on mechanical means. To give you a reference, down in the south central part of the state in the Gyp Hills, where they've had some huge wildfires in the last few years, some of the ranchers down there in some of those ravines, because it's pretty rough country down there, they will tell you that mechanically, in some areas, they've got over $1,000 an acre invested in trying to get that stuff moved out of there with skid steers, bulldozers, excavators, tree saws, you name it. They're spending obscene amounts of money for very little impact.
One more question.
How do you see goats or like browsers fitting into this?
Yeah, so that's a huge deal, and we'll talk about that more in a presentation tomorrow, but the small ruminant movement is here. And what's nice about that is that, as we all know, the multi-species grazing aspect of it, cattle is our main player in Kansas, but sheep and goats are really coming on. They help a tremendous amount with some of our lower statured woody species. And in the eastern part where we have Sericea lespedeza, they are a major player. They can really do some damage for us in a good way. For some of our woody species that get big and tall, Osage orange, some of our bigger cedars, they can do what they can up to 4 or 5 foot tall. But ultimately, where their bailiwick is the seedlings. Hopefully, we can use them as a source to keep the seedlings out. But in terms of taking care of the big ones, unfortunately, we're looking at burning, herbicides, mechanical. But the idea behind this is we want to try to get things done before we ever get to that stage.
All right, let's give him a round of applause.